Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Coming up on today's show, the 29th United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP29, is underway in Baku, Azerbaijan, and it's clear that the stakes are high for African nations facing the severe impacts of climate change. With a significant focus on climate finance, discussions have revolved around setting a new funding goal that could surpass the current $100 billion annual commitment, potentially reaching $1 trillion to support vulnerable nations. Climate activist Adenike Oladosu has been on the ground all week, and I'll be catching up with her shortly. And we'll be discussing the story of Hamdia Sidi, a young woman from Sokoto who bravely questioned local leaders about their response to violence against women in northern Nigeria. Her courage was met with arrest and later a violent assault, sparking outrage across the region. Voices for Inclusion and Equity, or VIEW, are now calling on leaders to take responsibility not only for protecting women, but also for supporting those who dare to speak out. Mariam Uwais, businesswoman, lawyer and human rights activist, will be joining me from Abuja with more on this story. Then later, I'll be looking back at some of the biggest business news stories of the week. But first, Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, announced his resignation on Tuesday amid mounting pressure over the Church of England's handling of a historical abuse allegation. His departure comes in the wake of the Mackin Review, an independent investigation that criticised the Church and Welby specifically for failing to address claims of abuse by John Smythe, a prominent Christian lawyer who allegedly abused over 100 boys and young men over several decades. Welby's resignation follows revelations that senior church leaders were aware of the abuse allegations since 2013. In his statement, Welby expressed profound shame over the institution's failings and acknowledged the responsibility for the Church's inadequate response between 2013 and 2024. He admitted he believed the situation would be resolved after being informed that police were notified in 2013, a decision he says he now regrets. Welby's resignation has stirred reactions across the Anglican community, including in Africa, where the Church's influence is significant. Some feel a sense of relief and justice, while others worry that this departure alone may not drive the systemic reform needed to overhaul the Church's safeguarding culture.
The essential issue here is that the Archbishop was informed about John Smythe's situation in 2013, but he failed to report it to the police. And that is why he's been alleged to have covered up this scandal rather than following the statutory processes that are now in place for the resolution of such matters so that they would be handled by the civil authorities, that is to say the police, and not the Church internally. The decisive role lies with the Prime Minister, who can choose to recommend to the Crown either one of the two who are nominated, or in very exceptional circumstances, and it has happened, both recommendations could be rejected and the Commission invited to make a further recommendation.
Well, for more on this, I was earlier joined in the studio by our Downing Street correspondent, Simon Pusey. Simon, I think it's fair to say there have been mixed reactions across the world, of course, following Tuesday's resignation of Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Of course, he's also the spiritual leader of the Church of England and the Anglican community across the world. If you're in the UK, you may have been familiar with the story because it was running for a couple of days, but most people aren't familiar with the story. However, in terms of abuse in the Church, in the Catholic Church too, it's become synonymous, hasn't it?
Yeah, and I think the worry is that this is, one bishop has come out and said this might be the tip of the iceberg. There may be many more cases like this. Justin Welby himself, in his resignation letter, said that he didn't want this to look like it was a conspiracy of silence, and that, you know, he'd been part of a cover-up. To be fair to him, I think most bishops and most people with knowledge of the story would say that
he shouldn't have resigned.
He shouldn't have resigned, that he thought the police had been made aware in 2013, but it's just not really good enough when the church has, sadly, a history of this kind of thing to not check absolutely everything is being done to try and stop this kind of abuse.
But the review did say that he didn't inform the police, the Mackin review.
Well, the review said exactly that he didn't
do enough.
For everything, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
He assumed, and it's not good enough to sort of assume in this day and age. So the fear is, I think, that more of these kind of scandals will come out. You could also say he's 68. He was around retirement age anyway, so it's not a huge deal. But actually, I think it is quite a big deal. Obviously, he took the funeral of the Queen. He took the coronation of the King.
He crowned the King.
Yeah, exactly. He crowned the King, and he married Prince Harry. So he was a big figure in the church.
Very close to the former president of Nigeria, Muhammadu Buhari. Too.
Yeah. So I think this will have sort of reverberations. I think a lot of people think he should have resigned earlier. It took him about a week to do it. And so that's not a very good look. But, a lot of people also say that this is not anything he could have really helped or done anything about. But it doesn't look good that John Smythe, this man, was a friend of his many decades before.
Right.
And so that isn't a good look. But I think most people would say there's nothing he could have done really differently. But to not, absolutely uncover every single stone, check everything is being done to prosecute people like that man who abused around 130 boys over a 5-decade period.
Goodness.
And was never brought to justice.
He's dead now, isn't he?
He is dead now, yeah.
John Smythe.
So I think that the bishop, one bishop in particular, is saying that this could be the tip of the iceberg. There could be more things out there. And I think for the Church of England, which has a bad history of cover-ups and of trying to cover itself, cover its own backs instead of finding the truth, the fear is that more things like this will emerge. Yeah,
clearly the Church cannot police itself. What is the Church of England like in Britain at this day and age? Because lots of accusations as well being thrown towards Justin Welby that he wasn't protecting Christianity the way perhaps we see imams, looking after Muslims and, with Islamophobia tackling that he didn't really stand up for Christianity, and that Christianity is now dying in this country.
Yeah, and
true?
I think if you look at the number of people going to church, it's fallen a lot since he took office. He's been there nearly 12 years.
Wow.
That might be a sign across the world. That might be a trend, a part of a wider trend. I think it's hard in modern day, isn't it, to think, does that really reflect what Christianity is? The number of people going to church? Are there other ways that people can pray at home and things like that? I think generally he was quite a moderate archbishop. In terms of, he was outspoken on a number of issues. He would talk against government policy, things like that, which is not necessarily his role. Exactly. And it'll be interesting to see what the next one brings, because it is really a figurehead role, but it's an important one. And he's been there for 12 years, so it's not an insignificant amount of time. And it'll be interesting to see how any new archbishop does differently, because in a modern day era where church attendances are declining, how do you reverse that trend?
Yeah, it's not effective immediate, is it? As you said, he was nearing retirement. I think he's supposed to go in 2026. He's still in position, is he?
He is, yes, until a successor is found, which is no easy thing.
No.
There's a couple of people in the running, but we'll have to see who it is and what they do differently, if anything.
Yes, thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you.
At the 29th United Nations Climate Change Conference in Baku, Azerbaijan, discussions are intensifying around the urgent need for enhanced climate finance to support vulnerable nations, with a push for new funding targets potentially reaching $1 trillion annually. For African nations where climate impacts are hitting hard, climate finance and practical strategies for adaptation and resilience have emerged as critical topics on the agenda. Another priority at COP29 has been implementing the Loss and Damage Fund, established at COP28, to help countries manage the unavoidable impacts of climate change. Climate activists have emphasised the importance of African nations ensuring their fair share of support from this fund, particularly to address climate-induced displacement and damage from extreme weather events. For more on this, I'm now being joined by Adenike Oladosu, who joins me now from the conference. Adenike Oladosu, thank you so much for joining me on Channels Business Global, our very own, Nigeria's very own iconic climate activist chasing world leaders around the world. It's quite interesting. I was looking down at my questions and I'm realising I'm asking you the same questions every year. I should know them off by heart. So talk to me about the main talking point for us, for Africa at COP, which of course is climate finance, a top priority. Same thing every year. Are you hoping to see some changes? Just give me an overview of what your first few days at COP have been, slightly overshadowed, of course, by last week's election in the US. Of course, we know Biden hasn't turned up. But talk to me about what you've seen and heard so far and whether or not you remain optimistic that change can come from a conference such as this.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. As we all know, this is COP29, and it's a reminder for the fact that we need to act as soon as possible on the climate crisis. And most importantly, why I'm at COP, being the new climate champion of education cannot wait to push for global financial investment on education to deal with the climate crisis, and most importantly, to push for more awareness and also more climate finance generally in innovations, technology, smart agriculture across all sectors. And conferences like this reminds us of the fact that we don't have time. We need to start to walk the talk. We need to start making leaders to see the reason why they need to act on the climate crisis and to shift away from the fossil fuel dependent economy to start seeing how we could transit effectively into sustainable activities. And basically is to see how we could also use the new collective quantified goal that is just set for COP29 to work on how financial tools for developing countries like Nigeria would be assessed, the needs, the priority. And so it's very important that we have climate finance on all our agenda, be it gender smart, technology, so that we could push forward in solving the climate change crisis, because we all know it's a multiple crisis and it's defining every country, but it affects the countries from the global south.
Last year, you were fortunate enough to speak with the President, Bola Tinubu, when he was in Paris. Of course, he's not there in Baku with you. He could be watching. What would you say to him?
Thank you so much. And also thank you so much for the invitation to meet with him. That was in France last year. And one of those concerns I raised while I met with him was the fossil fuel, because we know that Nigeria is fossil fuel dependent, but then we need to transit. We need to put all measures, because we know the root cause of the climate crisis is the fossil fuel. And so it dwells more on the need and demand for energy. And so we have the tools, we have the energy. I mean, when it comes to wind energy, solar energy, we have those solutions to solve the climate crisis. And so what we need in terms of Nigeria is the investment in the right tools, the right technology. Young people like me and other people are developing new technology every day. So we need those investments to position Nigerian youth towards harnessing those funds that could help young people to scale up in terms of innovations that are out there, and for us to also switch from the fossil fuel to more renewable energy. We have the solar, we have wind energy. We could develop on all of those energy structures to see that we are able to transit effectively and to also harness funding from the loss and damage, from the new financial tools, and for every other sources that could help Nigeria towards its transition.
Absolutely, really important fundamental points there. We do hope the change makers are listening, because it is an important discussion. But we will be following up. It would be great to hear from you this time next week, because I know, of course, COP does go for a couple of weeks. So it'd be interesting to see if some of these discussions around loss and damage fund and climate finance are actualised, not just pledged. We need implementation, don't we? Adenike Oladosu, who is a climate activist representing Nigeria at Baku once again. Thank you so much for your time and expertise. Coming up on Channel's Business Global, we'll be discussing the story of Hamdia Sidi, a young woman from Sokoto who bravely questioned local leaders about their response to violence against women in northern Nigeria. Her courage was met with arrest and later a violent assault, sparking outrage across the region. Voices for Inclusion and Equity, or VIEW, are now calling on leaders to take responsibility, not only for protecting women, but also for supporting those who dare to speak out. Mariam Uwais, businesswoman, lawyer, and human rights activist, will be joining me from Abuja with more on this story. And I'll be looking back at some of the biggest business news stories of the week. All of this after the break. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. In a moment, I'll be speaking with Mariam Uwais, businesswoman, lawyer and human rights activist. But until then, here's a breakdown of some of the biggest business news stories of the week. The UK Treasury has further reduced its stake in NatWest Group to 11.1%, following a significant share buyback deal. This move is part of the government's ongoing strategy to return NatWest, formerly known as the Royal Bank of Scotland, to full private ownership after its bailout during the 2008 financial crisis. The reduction from a previous 14.2% to the current 11.1% represents a continued commitment to privatise the bank, with the government having spent approximately £1 billion in the latest transaction. In a significant legal development, Shell has successfully appealed against a Dutch court's landmark climate ruling from 2021. The appeals court in The Hague overturned the previous decision, which had mandated Shell to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030, compared to 2019 levels. The court found that while Shell had an obligation to limit emissions, the specific reduction targets set by the lower court were not enforceable. This decision marks a pivotal moment for corporate climate responsibility and could influence similar legal actions globally. JustEatTakeaway.com has finalised the sale of its US subsidiary Grubhub to Wonder Group for approximately $650 million. This deal marks a significant exit for Just Eat Takeaway from the North American market, where Grubhub has faced stiff competition and decline in orders post the initial boom during COVID-19 lockdowns. Wonder Group, a New York-based company focused on restaurant technology and delivery solutions, acquired Grubhub for a fraction of what Just Eat Takeaway paid for it in 2021, indicating a cooling in the food delivery sector's valuation. The transaction includes $140 million in cash and the assumption of $500 million in debt, set to close in the first quarter of next year. And now to my final topic. In northern Nigeria, the Coalition Voices for Inclusion and Equity, or VIEW, is shedding light on the critical need for responsible leadership in addressing gender-based violence in conflict-ridden areas. Their stance is clear. True leadership is defined by responsibility, not position. This principle, they argue, is essential for addressing the escalating violence that women in these regions face on a daily basis. VIEW faces significant obstacles in pushing for protective policies for women in the region, and according to the coalition, entrenched political interests and lack of empathy from leaders create barriers to real change. Cases like that of Hamdia Sidi, who was allegedly arrested and later attacked for questioning local leaders on their response to violence against women, highlight a troubling trend of silencing those who speak out. Viewers called on state leaders to focus on security reforms that genuinely protect women. I'm glad to say that Mariam Uwais, businesswoman, lawyer, human rights activist and VIEW member, joins me now from Abuja for more on this. Mariam Uwais, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on Channel's Business Global today. Thank you so much for joining me, particularly on such an important talking point. Lots of our viewers may not even be familiar with the name Hamdia Sidi. So before we get into the details of the View's open letter, which I received earlier this week, which is why we're having this conversation. Could you please give us an understanding of what happened to her and what has led to this coalition of pretty powerful Northern women coming together to talk about leadership?
Yeah, so thank you for having me and grateful for this opportunity. What happened was we saw a video of a young girl, obviously in the rural areas, saying that the leaders should have some empathy, and that there's this girl, Hamdia, who had spoken out and called out the governor for the challenges they were having in Sokoto State. And she identified herself. This is where she lived, and bandits had been to the village near her and had, burnt up some homes and shot some people, and that Hamdia had now been arrested for calling out the governor, of course. So we now saw the videos that Hamdia had released, and she was actually emphasizing on the fact that she was encouraging them to go to school in the community. She was with a lot of other people in the village, and she was asking them to affirm or not whether this had happened in their village, and they did. She said the bandits had attacked them for like at least 10 occasions, and that they all voted for the leaders in the state, and that ever since these attacks started, she asked them, has one leader, and she wasn't just talking about the governor then, she was saying even the members of the House of Assembly, any commissioner, has anybody been to empathize or to give them palliatives or anything at least to indicate that they were aware that this was happening? And they all said no.
We've got to be careful because we do not have an account from the Sokoto state governor or Sokoto here.
Yes.
But of course, I know I'm speaking to a very credible, reputable lady, and you're representing a very powerful group of women. I don't want to cut you, but of course, this has led to the View once again collating together. And I do want to talk about the letter that you composed and compiled after speaking to Hamdia, because this is what I want us to talk about, which is about leadership and the fact that you say true leadership is about responsibility, not position. And I want you to talk to how this applies to tackling gender-based violence, and not just in northern Nigeria. You read a lot of news. You know that we have issues with gender-based violence here where I'm sitting in London. So talk to me about the broader context, if you can, to avoid any trouble.
Yes, okay. I'd like to say also that Hamdia was fair. At least when she was talking to me, she mentioned that there was a policeman that was really kind and empathetic and told her where to stay and all of that. But the challenge we have is there's so much going on in the rural areas that, unless we have feedback, we have monitors out there or people who can advise, or paralegals. We don't have enough paralegals in the communities, enough trained paralegals, people who can also counsel, therapists and all of that. We don't have enough of them. But it was just because of this social media video that this thing came to us. And unfortunately, there are many, many things happening that are atrocious in the communities. And all we intended to do, or what we intend to do, is to see how we can support these girls. Because Hamdia does not seem to have that much of an education. I don't think she went to university, and yet I watched her in the videos talking to these women and these children, and she obviously had leadership qualities that were innate. Talking to them and they were listening to her. And so we were very impressed and felt that she needed to be safe. She said to me that she was in hiding at that point. She was being treated from her hideout. And this is where we are. We decided that, look, it's not right that this should be happening just because people are frustrated and they feel helpless. They turn to these methods to draw attention and to be able to, invite empathy from the leaders. I think that was the entire purpose, to try and attract the empathy of people in the community and in the public generally.
Of course, we know that,
Yes.
your open letter has gone far and wide, and we're talking about it here, thousands of miles away in London. The Channel's Business Global platform is an absolute advocate for women in leadership across all levels, including the leadership you said Hamdia displayed when she was speaking and comforting women and children with very little education. Now her name is across the world because of you. Thank you so much, Mariam Ouais, who of course is a businesswoman, lawyer, human rights activist, and she wears many, many hats underneath that hat. Thank you so much for your time. And we will be following Hadia's story. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Well, sadly, that's all we have time for today. But as always, do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channel's Business Global. Goodbye.